Welcome to Alien Whisper, where sizzling hot alien women and emotional sci-fi alien stories await you. If you enjoy thrilling adventures between humans and extraterrestrial beings, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below the video. Now, let's dive into the story. It was just another job, fixing a busted ship on a desolate planet. But when I found her, half buried in the sand, her violet eyes burning with desperation, I knew this was no ordinary repair. She wasn't just stranded, she was hunted, and now, with mercenaries closing in, I had to decide, help her and risk everything, or leave her to face whatever dark secret she was running from. But when she asked me to mark her as mine, something inside me stirred. I had no idea that fixing her ship would lead me to a world and a future I never saw coming. The wind howled across the dunes, carrying the dry, blistering heat of the desert planet. Grant wiped the sweat from his brow, gripping the worn steering wheel of his old rover as he scanned the endless sea of sand for any sign of life, or, more importantly, spare parts. Beside him sat his daughter, A.A., her small hands clutching a toy spaceship, her wide eyes taking in the strange, barren landscape. "Daddy, is this where monsters live?" she asked, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. Grant chuckled softly. "No, sweetheart. Just sand and maybe some broken machines we can fix." As they crested a tall dune, something glinted in the distance, a flash of metal catching the harsh sunlight. Grant slowed the rover, squinting to get a better look. There, half buried in the sand, was a spaceship, its sleek design standing out like a jewel against the rugged terrain. One of its thrusters hung loose, torn from its socket, and lying useless nearby. "Look at that, eh?" Grant said, his tone brightening with curiosity. "Looks like someone needs our help." A.A. perked up, leaning forward. "Like when you fix our rover?" "Exactly," he replied, grinning. He parked the rover a safe distance away and stepped out, A.A. hopping down after him, her little boots kicking up puffs of dust. As they approached the ship, a figure emerged from behind it. A tall woman with skin that shimmered a faint violet under the fading light. Her long hair flowed like liquid starlight, catching the sun's rays in a way that made it glow. She wore a bodysuit that clung to her curves, woven from some advanced material that shimmered with intricate patterns, hinting at technology far beyond anything Grant had seen on the frontier. He stopped short, his breath hitching. She was stunning, alien in every sense, and clearly in trouble. "Hey there," he called, raising a hand in a friendly wave. "I'm Grant, and this is my daughter, A.A. Looks like your ship's seen better days." The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized him up, then softened as they landed on A. "I am Alera," she said, her voice smooth and melodic, carrying a refined edge that suggested she wasn't just some stranded traveler. "My ship took damage in a fight up in orbit. I landed here, but I don't have the tools to repair it." Grant nodded, already eyeing the wrecked thruster. "Well, I'm a mechanic, used to patch up ships in the old planetary defense fleet. I've got some gear in the rover. Let's see what we can do." He headed back to unload his toolkit, a battered box of wrenches, wires, and a trusty conduction spanner that had gotten him out of more jams than he could count. Meanwhile, toddled over to Alera, holding out her toy spaceship with a shy smile. "Want to play?" Alera knelt down to A.A.'s level, her movements graceful yet deliberate, like someone used to bending for anyone. She took the toy gently, turning it over in her hands. "What's this?" "It's my ship," he said, puffing out her chest. "It flies super fast." Alera's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes, a striking lilac, softening. "It's very impressive. You're quite the engineer, aren't you?" A.A. giggled, delighted, and Grant couldn't help but glance over, struck by how Alera's demeanor shifted around his daughter. She seemed almost curious, like a scientist studying something new, but there was warmth there too. Shaking off the thought, he crouched by the ship's thruster, prying off a panel to reveal a mess of cables and scorched circuits. He let out a low whistle. "This is some high-end tech, not your average trader's rig. What happened up there?" Alera stood, brushing sand from her knees as she moved closer. "Debris, or something like it, hit me in orbit. I barely made it down in one piece. Her answer was vague, but Grant didn't push. He'd met enough folks on the frontier to know people kept their secrets close. Instead, he got to work, pulling out tools and sorting through the damage. We'll start by reattaching this thruster, then figure out the wiring. Shouldn't take too long. Alera watched him, her presence calm but commanding. I'm grateful for this, Grant. I wasn't sure how I'd get out of here without help. He shrugged, flashing a lopsided grin. It's what I do. Besides, out here, we're all just trying to survive. Might as well lend a hand. As he worked, A played nearby, scooping sand into little piles and chattering to herself. Every so often, she'd run over to Alera with a handful of sand or a shiny pebble, offering them like treasures. Alera accepted each gift with a nod, her fingers brushing Ace as she took them, and Grant noticed how careful she was, like she didn't want to scare the girl. The sun dipped lower, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Grant found himself working alongside Alera more than he'd expected. She handed him tools without being asked, holding panels steady while he spliced wires. Her knowledge surprised him. She pointed out a cluster of fiber optic lines he'd nearly missed, explaining how they fed the thruster's power grid. You've done this before, he said, half a question. She hesitated, her eyes flickering from lilac to a deeper purple. I've had to learn. Traveling alone leaves little room for ignorance. There was a story there, but Grant let it slide, focusing on the job. He liked her quiet confidence, the way she didn't flinch at the mess of circuits. And yeah, he couldn't deny she was easy on the eyes, with that bodysuit showing off every curve. But it was her smarts that kept his attention. Hours passed, the desert growing quiet except for the faint hum of the rover's engine and A's occasional giggles. Finally, Grant stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants. Think we're good. Let's fire it up and see. Alera climbed into the cockpit, her movements fluid as she tapped the controls. The thruster sputtered, then roared to life, a soft blue glow pulsing from its core. She turned to him, a real smile breaking through her guarded expression. It works? Thank you, Grant. I don't know what I'd have done without you. He waved it off. Just glad I could help. You're back in business. But before they could savor the moment, a low rumble shook the ground. Grant spun around, his stomach dropping as he saw dust clouds rising in the distance. Shapes emerged, vehicles sleek and armored, tearing across the dunes with purpose. Mercenaries, no doubt, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. Get in the ship, he yelled, scooping A into his arms and bolting for the hatch. Alera was already at the controls, her fingers dancing over the panels with urgency. They've found me, she muttered, her voice tight. We need to go now. Grant strapped A into a seat, her toy spaceship clutched tight, and buckled himself in as the ship shuddered to life. Outside, the vehicles closed in, their weapons flashing as they opened fire. Laser blasts and bullets ricocheted off the hull, pinging like hail on metal. Hold on, Alera shouted, yanking the controls. The ship lurched upward, sand spraying in all directions as it broke free of the desert's grip. Grant gripped the armrests, his heart pounding as they climbed higher. He glanced at A, her eyes wide with fear, and reached over to squeeze her hand. We're okay, kiddo. Just a little adventure. Through the viewport, he saw the attackers fading into the distance, their shots falling short as the ship punched through the atmosphere. The roar of the engines filled the cabin, a steady hum that promised escape. Alera exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly, though her hands stayed firm on the controls. She turned to Grant, her eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and something unspoken. I owe you more than just thanks. When we're safe, I'll explain everything. He nodded, adrenaline still buzzing in his veins. Wherever you're headed, looks like we're along for the ride now. The ship streaked into the black void of space, leaving the desert planet behind, and Grant couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter had just changed his life, and Ace forever. The ship trembled as it broke free from the desert planet's atmosphere, the roar of the thrusters filling the small cockpit with a deep, steady hum. Grant gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white, while AA clung to her toy spaceship, her little face pressed against his arm. The viewport showed stars streaking into view, the vast blackness of space swallowing the sandy world below. He stole a glance at Alera, her violet hands steady on the controls, her jaw set with determination. The glow from the panels lit up her face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the faint shimmer of her skin. "We're clear," she said, her voice cutting through the engine's rumble. "For now." Grant exhaled, loosening his grip. "That was close. Who were those guys?" Alera didn't answer right away, her eyes flicking to a small screen flashing with data. "Enemies," she said finally, her tone clipped. "They've been hunting me for a while." He wanted to ask more, why she was a target, but a sharp jolt rocked the ship, cutting him off. The thruster's hum faltered, replaced by an uneven sputter, and a warning light blinked red on the console. "Damn it," Grant muttered, unbuckling his harness. "Thought we had that fixed." Alera frowned, tapping the controls. "It's holding, but something's off. We're losing power to the starboard side." Grant leaned over her shoulder, close enough to catch a faint scent, like ozone mixed with something floral, coming off her. "Let me take a look." Stay put, okay?" "Okay, Daddy," chirped, though her eyes were still wide from the escape. He moved to a hatch near the back of the cockpit, prying it open with his spanner. Inside, a tangle of wires and glowing conduits pulsed faintly, the ship's lifeblood laid bare. The repair he'd done in the desert had held up under the takeoff, but the strain must have shaken something loose. He traced a bundle of cables, spotting a faint scorch mark where energy had arced. "Found it," he called out. "Looks like a short circuit. I can bypass it, but I'll need some time." "Take what you need," Alera replied, her voice steady despite the tension. "I'll keep us moving." Grant rummaged through his toolkit, pulling out a spool of universal wiring and a pair of cutters. The ship's tech was alien, literally, but he'd seen enough systems in his fleet days to figure it out. He worked fast, splicing the damaged lines and rigging a temporary fix, his hands moving with the muscle memory of years spent patching up wrecks. As he tightened the last connection, the ship lurched again, harder this time. A muffled boom echoed through the hull, and AA let out a small yelp. Grant's head snapped up. "What was that?" Alera cursed under her breath, a sharp, musical sound in her native tongue. "They're back." Two ships closing fast. Grant scrambled to the viewport, peering out. Sure enough, two sleek fighters emerged from the void, their hulls glinting like predators in the starlight. They were smaller than Alera's craft, built for speed and firepower, and they were gaining. "Can we outrun them?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Not with a thruster like this," she said, her fingers flying over the controls. "I'll try to lose them in the asteroid field ahead." The ship veered sharply, banking toward a cluster of jagged rocks floating in space. Grant braced himself against the wall, watching as Alera piloted with precision, weaving between the spinning debris. The fighters followed, their weapons flaring, bright streaks of plasma that grazed the ship's shields, sending sparks crackling across the hull. "Hang on," Alera shouted, pulling the ship into a tight roll. AA squeaked, clutching her toy tighter, and Grant dropped her aside, wrapping an arm around her. "We're okay, kiddo," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "Just a bumpy ride." But the bumps turned into chaos. A direct hit slammed into the rear, and the cockpit lights flickered. Alera grunted, gripping the console as the ship spun, a shrill alarm blaring in their ears. Grant's stomach flipped as he caught sight of her, blood trickling down her arm, a jagged gash from flying debris slicing through her bodysuit. "You're hurt," he yelled over the noise. "It's nothing," she snapped, though her face tightened with pain. "Focus on the thruster." He hesitated, torn between her and AA, but another blast rocked the ship, snapping him into action. "Stay with me, AA," he said, kissing her forehead before rushing back to the hatch. The bypass was still intact, but the power surge had fried a secondary conduit. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he yanked out the charred piece, replacing it with a spare from his kit. The fighters were relentless. Every dodge Alera pulled bought them seconds, but the ship couldn't take much more. He could hear the shields groaning, a low whine that spelled trouble. Almost there, he muttered, connecting the last wire. The thruster's hum steadied, the blue glow strengthening. Try now. Alera punched the controls, and the ship surged forward, weaving through the asteroids with renewed speed. The fighters lagged for a moment, caught off guard, and she seized the chance, diving behind a massive rock to break their line of sight. Grant stumbled back to the cockpit, breathing hard. That should hold, but we're not out of this yet. She nodded, her eyes locked on the scanners. They're circling, looking for us. He noticed her arm again. The blood had soaked into her suit, staining the violet fabric dark. Let me see that, he said, grabbing a medkit from under his seat. It's fine, she protested, but he was already kneeling beside her, pulling out a bandage. You're bleeding all over your fancy ship, he said, keeping his tone light. Humor me. She relented, holding out her arm. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound, a shallow cut, thankfully, and wrapping it tight. Her skin was cool to the touch, smoother than he'd expected, and up close, he couldn't help but notice the way her bodysuit hugged her frame, accentuating every curve. His fingers brushed hers as he tied off the bandage, and for a split second, their eyes met, hers shifting from lilac to a warm violet, like a blush he couldn't quite read. Thanks, she said quietly, pulling her arm back. Anytime, he replied, clearing his throat and stepping away. How's the ship holding? Better, she said, checking the readouts. Your fix gave us enough juice to make it through this field. But we need to shake these guys. Grant glanced at the scanners, the red dots of the fighters still prowling nearby. Got any tricks up your sleeve? Alera's lips twitched, almost a smirk. This ship's got a few surprises. Watch this. She flipped a switch, and a low hum vibrated through the floor. Grant raised an eyebrow as a panel slid open, revealing a sleek device pulsing with green light. What's that? Organic pulse emitter, she said. It mimics a distress signal. Should confuse their sensors. She activated it, and a wave of energy rippled out, invisible but effective. The fighters hesitated, their paths veering as their screens likely lit up with false readings. Alera didn't waste time, banking hard to the left and gunning the engines, slipping deeper into the asteroid field. Nice move, Grant said, impressed. Where'd you pick that up? Long story, she replied, her focus unwavering. Let's just say I've had to get creative out here. The ship steadied, the alarms quieting as they put distance between themselves and the pursuers. Grant sank into his seat, running a hand through his hair. AA crawled into his lap, her small body trembling slightly. We're safe now, right? She asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Yeah, kiddo, he said, hugging her tight. We're good. But new alert beeped on the console, sharp and insistent. Alera's expression darkened as she pulled up a holomap, a blinking dot marking their position, and another, much larger ship closing in. They've called reinforcements, she said, her voice low. A frigate. We can't outrun that. Ganz gut twisted. What's the play? She turned to him, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion creeping in. We fight, or we hide. Your call. He looked at AA, then back at the map. Hiding meant risking detection. Fighting meant putting his daughter in danger. Neither sat right, but he'd be damned if he let these bastards win. Can we use that emitter again? By time to fix the ship proper? Alera nodded slowly. It might work, but we'll need a better spot, somewhere they won't expect. Over there, Grant said, pointing to a dense cluster of asteroids. Tight quarters. They'll have to slow down to follow. She adjusted course, guiding the ship into the maze of rock and ice. The frigate loomed on the scanners, its weapons priming, but the asteroids forced it to hang back. Alera deployed the emitter again, scattering fake signals, and for a moment, the tension eased. Grant returned to the hatch, double-checking his repairs. The thruster was stable, but the shields were battered, and the power grid flickered under the strain. He patched what he could, using every trick he knew to keep them aloft. As he worked, Alera's voice drifted back to him, softer now. You're good at this. Better than most mechanics I've met. Years of practice, he said, grinning despite the chaos. Had to keep my old fleet bucket flying through worse than this. She laughed, a short, musical sound that caught him off guard. "I'd like to hear that story sometime." "Deal," he said, finishing the last connection. "Thrusters solid. Shields are at half, but we'll make it." She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his again, and this time there was something warmer in them, gratitude, maybe, or something more. "Good, because we're not done yet." Before he could respond, a massive shadow darkened the viewport. The frigate had found them, its cannons glowing red as it locked on. Alera yanked the controls, and the ship dove, narrowly dodging a barrage of plasma bolts that lit up the asteroids around them. "Hold tight," she yelled, and Grant grabbed AA, shielding her as the ship spiraled through space, the hunters closing in. The ship shuddered as plasma bolts exploded against the asteroid field, their fiery trails lighting up the cockpit in flashes of red and orange. Grant held AA tight, her small body pressed against his chest, her toy spaceship digging into his ribs. Alera wrestled with the controls, her violet hands gripping the yoke as she swerved through the chaos, the frigate's massive shadow looming closer on the viewport. The shields crackled with every near miss, a high-pitched whine filling the air like a wounded animal. "Shields are down to 30%, Grant shouted, glancing at the flickering console. "We can't take much more of this." "I know," Alera snapped, her voice sharp but steady. "I'm trying to get us clear." She yanked the ship into a tight spiral, dodging a barrage that shattered a nearby asteroid into a spray of jagged fragments. The debris pinged off the hull, a relentless drumbeat that set Grant's teeth on edge. He could feel the strain in the thruster he'd patched, its hum growing ragged, pushing the limits of his quick fix. AA whimpered, burying her face in his shirt. "Daddy, make it stop." "I'm working on it, kiddo," he said, stroking her hair, though his eyes stayed locked on Alera. "Got any more tricks? Or are we sitting ducks here?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes, now a stormy purple, darting to the holomap. "There's a jump point ahead. If we can reach it, we might lose them in hyperspace." Grant nodded, adrenaline sharpening his focus. "How far?" 2 minutes, she said, banking hard to avoid another volley. "Maybe less if we don't get hit again." The frigate fired, a searing beam slicing through space just meters from the ship's tail. The cockpit lurched, and Alera grunted, her injured arm trembling as she fought to hold course. Grant's stomach twisted. He hated seeing her hurt, but there was no time to play medic now. "Keep her steady," he said, unbuckling himself. "I'll boost the shield from the grid." He stumbled to the rear hatch, the ship's rocking throwing him against the walls. Inside, the power conduits glowed fitfully, sparks spitting from overstressed circuits. He grabbed his spanner, rerouting what little energy remained to the shields, his hands moving fast but precise. It wasn't a permanent fix, just enough to buy them those precious seconds. "Shields at 40%, he called out, slamming the hatch shut and staggering back to his seat. "That's all I've got." "It'll do," Alera replied, her voice tight with focus. The jump point loomed on the map, a swirling vortex of light against the black. "Hold on." The ship surged forward, engines screaming as she pushed them to the brink. The frigate adjusted its aim, cannons glowing ominously, but Alera was faster. She punched the hyperspace controls, and the universe stretched, stars blurring into long, brilliant lines as reality warped around them. Grant's stomach flipped, a dizzying rush hitting him as the ship snapped into the jump, leaving the fighters and their frigate behind. Silence fell, heavy and sudden, broken only by the soft hum of the engines. The viewport showed a tunnel of shimmering light, the strange beauty of hyperspace unfolding before them. Grant exhaled, slumping in his seat, A still clinging to him. "We made it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Alera leaned back, her shoulders sagging with relief. "For now, that jump should throw them off, but they'll keep looking." He studied her, sweat beading on her brow, blood staining the bandage he'd tied, her bodysuit torn at the shoulder. She looked exhausted, but there was a fire in her that hadn't dimmed. "You okay?" he asked, softer this time. She met his gaze, her eyes shifting to a softer violet. I'll manage. Thanks to you. He waved it off, but the gratitude in her voice stuck with him. AA peeked up, her fear easing. Are we flying really fast now? Yeah, kiddo, Grant said, ruffling her hair. Faster than anything. Alera smiled faintly, watching the exchange, and for a moment, the tension melted away. But then a new beep sounded, sharp, insistent, pulling them back to reality. She checked the console, her expression darkening. What now? Grant asked, bracing himself. The hyperdrive's couplings are glitching, she said, pulling up a diagnostic. That last hit must have shaken something loose. We can't stay in hyperspace long like this. Grant cursed under his breath. Show me. She led him to a narrow corridor behind the cockpit. A maintenance base stuffed with blinking panels and organic-looking conduits that pulsed like veins. He'd never seen anything like it. Her ship wasn't just advanced. It was alive in some way, its tech woven with something natural. She pried open a compartment, revealing blackened fuses and a tangle of charred wires. See this? She said, pointing. The warp spool's misaligned. It'll burn out if we don't fix it. Grant knelt beside her, toolbox in hand. I've got a spare fuse, but it's not rated for this voltage. We'll need to reroute power to stabilize it. She nodded, her closeness sending a jolt through him. Her scent, that mix of ozone and flowers, stronger now. They worked together, his hands steady as he replaced the fuse, hers deft as she adjusted the conduits. Their fingers brushed once, twice, and he caught her glancing at him, her eyes lingering a beat too long. You're not just a traveler, are you? He said, breaking the silence. That frigate wasn't random. Who are you, Alera? She froze, then sighed, sitting back on her heels. I suppose you deserve the truth. My name is Alera Novath of the Novath dynasty. I'm a princess, technically. My family rules a sector in the central systems, wealth, power, all of it, but comes with enemies. Grant blinked, processing. A princess? You're kidding. I wish I were, she said, her voice heavy. I was out here to avoid them, assassins, rivals, anyone who wants what my family has. That ship in the desert? It's mine, but it's also a target. He whistled low. And here I thought you were just a fancy wanderer with a busted ride. She smirked, a flicker of humor breaking through. I prefer it that way. The fewer who know, the safer I am. But you've earned the truth, Grant. You and AA are in this now. He nodded, the weight of it settling in. Guess we're not splitting up anytime soon. Huh? Not if I can help it, she said, and there was something in her tone, gratitude, maybe trust, that made his chest tighten. As they finished the repair, the hyperdrive's rumble steadied, the readings climbing to a shaky but functional 90%. Grant wiped his hands, standing close to her in the cramped space. Should get us where we're going. Speaking of, where are we going? Alera hesitated, her eyes searching his. I was headed for a neutral zone, a place to lay low. But with that frigate on my tail, we might need a better plan. Like what? He asked, leaning against the wall. Somewhere they won't follow, she said. A border outpost, maybe. I've got contacts there, old allies from my fleet days. But it's risky. He grinned despite the odds. Risky's my middle name. Well, not really. It's Daniel, but you get the point. She laughed, a soft, unexpected sound that lit up her face. You're full of surprises, Grant. Stick around, he teased. There's more where that came from. Their eyes locked, and the air shifted, charged, like the moment before a storm. She stepped closer, or maybe he did, and suddenly they were inches apart, her breath warm against his skin. He could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, feel the pull of something unspoken. His hand brushed her arm, lingering where the bandage met her skin, and she didn't pull away. Grant, she started, her voice low, almost a whisper. But before anything could happen, AA's voice piped up from the cockpit. Daddy, the lights are blinking funny. The spell broke. Grant stepped back, clearing his throat, and Alera turned away, her cheeks tinged a deeper purple. We should check that, she said quickly. Yeah, he agreed, following her back, his heart still racing. The console showed a warning, proximity sensors picking up a faint signal. Alera frowned, pulling up the data. It's a transmission. Encrypted. Can you crack it? He asked, settling AA on his lap. She nodded, her fingers dancing over the keys. A voice crackled through, distorted but urgent. Novith, compromised, retreat to designated coordinates. Alera's face paled. It's from my father. He's in danger, captured, maybe. They're using him to draw me out. Grant's jaw tightened. Those bastards from the frigate? Or worse, she said, her voice trembling slightly. My family's enemies are ruthless. If they got him, she trailed off, and he saw the fear in her eyes. Real, raw, and human, despite her alien grace. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure it out. You're not alone in this. She looked at him, gratitude softening her features. Thank you. I didn't expect any of this. Neither did I, he said, thinking of his wife. Gone 3 years now, lost to a frontier plague, leaving him and AA to scrape by. But I'm here. We're here. Alera nodded, a silent pact forming between them. She adjusted the hyperdrive, plotting a course based on the transmission's coordinates. It's a long shot, but it's our best chance. The ship hummed, readying for another jump. Grant held AA close, watching as Alera worked, her strength and vulnerability blending in a way that drew him in deeper. He didn't know what lay ahead. More danger, for sure, but he knew one thing. He wasn't walking away. Ready? She asked, glancing at him. Ready, he said, and with a lurch, the ship leapt back into hyperspace, stars stretching into infinity as they raced toward an uncertain fate. The ship dropped out of hyperspace with a jolt, the tunnel of light collapsing into a field of stars. Grant steadied himself, holding AA close as the engines whined down to a low hum. Through the viewport, a fractured planet loomed, its surface scarred with craters, ringed by a jagged belt of debris. On the far side, a small outpost floated, its battered hull bristling with sensor arrays and docked with a handful of rough-looking crafts. There it is, Alera said, her voice taut as she guided the ship into stealth mode, dimming its lights and cutting engine power to a whisper. The border outpost. If my father's message is right, we'll find help here. Grant nodded, peering at the station. Looks like a rough crowd. You sure about this? No, she admitted, her eyes, now a deep violet, meeting his. But it's our best shot. My father's life depends on it. He squeezed AA's hand, her small form curled against him. Then let's make it quick. Who are we looking for? An old contact, Alera said, adjusting the controls. Bastion, ex-mercenary. He owes me a favor from way back. The ship glided silently toward an auxiliary dock, latching onto a pylon with a soft clang. Grant rummaged through a supply closet, pulling out a worn jacket and a cap to blend in, then handed AA a little scarf to wrap around her shoulders. Stay close, kiddo, he said, hoisting her up. Alera led the way, her bodysuit shimmering faintly as they stepped into the outpost's flickering corridors. The air was stale, thick with the smell of oil and metal, and neon signs buzzed overhead, advertising shady deals and cheap fuel. They moved cautiously, avoiding the eyes of grizzled traders and armed guards, until they reached a quiet nook near a broken cargo lift. Grant pulled out a battered comm device, tapping in an old frequency from his fleet days. Static hissed, then a gruff voice crackled through. Who's this? Grant, he said, keeping his voice low. I'm with Alera Novith. She says you owe her one. Bastion. A pause, then a rough laugh. Alera, huh? Thought she'd forgotten me. What's the job? Her father's been taken, Grant said. We need a crew to get him out. She's got credits if you're in. Another pause, then send your coordinates. I'll bite for the right price. Grant ended the call, glancing at Alera. He's cagey, but he's coming. Hope he's as good as you say. He is, she replied, her tone firm. He saved my skin before. They waited, tension thick, until heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Bastion appeared, a broad man with a short beard, scars crisscrossing his arms, leaning against a crate with a skeptical grin. His eyes lingered on AA, then widened slightly at Alera's regal stance. Well, damn, he said, crossing his arms. Royalty slumming out here. What's the deal? Alera stepped forward, unflinching. My father's held in a fortress near my home system. Political rivals. Mercenaries they hired. I need him out, Bastion. Name your price. He scratched his chin, eyeing her torn bodysuit. 10 million credits. Extraction's messy, and I don't work cheap. Grant nearly choked, but Alera didn't blink. Done. But no slip-ups. We do this clean. Bastion smirked, tapping his comm deal. Meet me at the docking bay in 10. They followed him through the outpost's maze, arriving at a wide corridor lined with crates. His crew, 5 tough-looking men and women, waited by a stealth shuttle, gear slung over their shoulders. Bastion laid out the plan. Infiltrate a fortress on a remote moon, disable its defenses, grab Alera's father, and get out before the enemy rallied. Simple enough, Grant said, though his gut said otherwise. He adjusted AA's scarf, keeping her close as they boarded Alera's ship, Bastion's shuttle trailing behind. The jump to the moon was quick, the ships skimming past security drones to land in a hidden canyon. Bastion's team geared up, stealth suits, pulse rifles, while Grant calibrated a jamming device from the shuttle's kit. Alera studied a hollow map of the fortress, high walls, turrets, sentinel droids. Her father was in a panic chamber deep inside, guarded by council traitors aiming to seize her family's power. We go at dusk, Bastion said, checking his rifle. Decoys first, then we breach. Grant stayed back with AA, prepping the ship for a fast getaway. You're not playing this one, huh? He asked her, half teasing. She giggled, fiddling with her toy. I'm helping you fly, Daddy. The team launched as the sky darkened, decoys scrambling the fortress's scanners with false signals. Grant listened through the comms, quiet pops as alarms went down, a hushed report of a droid knocked out. Then a ping. They'd reached the chamber. Everything seemed on track, until it wasn't. The fortress flared to life, lights blazing, heavy blasts echoing through the canyon. Bastion's voice crackled, frantic. We're pinned. Turrets everywhere. Lost 2 already. Alera's fists clenched, her eyes wild. I'm going in, she said, grabbing a slender weapon from her ship's wall. Grant caught her arm. You'll get shredded out there. Wait. That's my father, she snapped, pulling free. I promised him I'd come. He hesitated, then unbuckled. AA. Fine, but we're doing this smart. I'll jam the turrets. AA, stay here. Hide under the seat if it gets loud. She nodded, clutching her toy as he followed Alera out. The moon's surface was a chaos of dust and laser fire. Bastion's team pinned near a breached wall. Grant sprinted to the shuttle, powering up its jamming module while Alera took cover, her weapon humming as she fired precise shots at a turret. Link me to the fortress grid, he yelled, typing fast. She tossed him a comm link, and he spliced it into the system, feeding false data to the turrets. Their barrels wavered, confused, giving Bastion's crew a window to advance. But the frigate from earlier descended, its shadow darkening the battlefield. A hatch opened, dropping more droids, sleek, deadly, closing in fast. Grant cursed, grabbing his sidearm, a cheap pulse pistol, and joined Alera behind a rock. We're boxed in, she said, her breath ragged. I can't reach them. Not yet, he replied, firing at a droid's leg, slowing it. Focus. Any tricks left? Her eyes narrowed, then widened. Maybe. Cover me. She closed her eyes, a faint glow pulsing from her temples. Grant stared, her telepathic ability, something she'd hinted at, now in play. A droid froze mid-step, its head twitching, then turned, firing on its own kind. The others faltered, their coordination breaking. How'd you? He started, but she cut him off. Later. Move. They dashed forward, weaving through the chaos to a side entrance Bastion's team had blasted open. Inside, the fortress was a mess, scorched walls, broken droids, and one of Bastion's men slumped against a pillar, blood pooling beneath him. They've got him deeper, the soldier rasped. Panic chamber. Bastion stuck ahead. Alera nodded, resolute. Stay here. We'll finish this. Grant hacked a control panel, opening a sealed door where Bastion's shouts echoed. They burst in, finding him and 2 others pinned by guards in a tight corridor. Grant tossed a sonic grenade from the shuttle's kit. Its pop disorienting the enemy. Alera fired, dropping one guard, while Bastion finished the other. "Where's my father?" she demanded. "Into the hall," Bastion said, panting. "Turrets are still active." Grant synced his jammer to the sub-turrets, typing furiously. "Got it, go now." They ran, dodging stray shots, until they reached the panic chamber. Alera punched the lock, the door hissing open to reveal an older man in ornate robes, battered but alive. His eyes, lilac like hers, lit up with relief. "Alera," he rasped, standing shakily. "Father," she said, rushing to him, her voice breaking. Grant kept watch, his pistol ready as Bastion's team secured the exit. "We're not clear yet. That frigate's still up there." Alera helped her father up, his arm over her shoulder. "We'll make it. Together." The fortress shook as the frigate bombarded the surface, but Grant led them back to the shuttle, Alera's telepathic nudge disabling a final droid in their path. They piled in, Bastion slamming the controls, and the craft rocketed out, weaving through the canyon as explosions lit the sky. Back on Alera's ship, Grant strapped AA in, her eyes wide but safe. "You okay, kiddo?" She nodded, hugging him. "You're a hero, Daddy." He smiled, glancing at Alera, who met his gaze with a tired but grateful nod. They'd done it, against all odds, and the fight wasn't over, but for now they'd won. The ship hummed softly as it docked at the Novith capital, a gleaming city of crystal spires stretching into a violet sky. Grant stood at the viewport, perched on his shoulders, her toy spaceship waving as she marveled at the towering structures. After the chaos of the rescue, the fortress, the frigate, the relentless droid assaults, this felt like stepping into a dream. Alera stood beside him, her father recovering in the medical bay, his strength returning with every hour. The weight of their victory settled over them, a quiet triumph after days of running and fighting. "Welcome to my home," Alera said, her voice warm but tinged with fatigue. Her bodysuit had been replaced by a flowing robe, its silver threads catching the light, making her look every bit the princess she was. Her eyes, a soft lilac now, met Grant's with gratitude. "You didn't have to do all this, you know. You..." And AA could have walked away. Grant shrugged, adjusting AA's scarf. "Yeah, well, we're not big on walking away. Besides, you needed us." She smiled, a real one that lit up her face. "More than you know." They stepped off the ship into a grand hangar, its walls pulsing with organic circuits, a hallmark of Novith tech, blending metal and life. Attendants in sleek uniforms bowed as Alera passed, their eyes curious but respectful when they landed on Grant and AA. He felt out of place, a dusty mechanic in a world of royalty, but Alera's presence grounded him. The palace was a marvel, its halls lined with glowing tapestries that shifted like starfields. AA tugged at Grant's hand, pointing at a floating orb that hummed softly, trailing light as it guided them. "Daddy, it's magic." "Not magic," Alera said, kneeling to AA's level. "Just a little Novith engineering. Want to see more?" AA nodded eagerly, and Alera led them through the palace, explaining its wonders. Gardens where plants sang in harmonic frequencies, chambers where gravity could shift for meditation. Grant listened, half distracted by her voice, the way it softened when she spoke to AA or caught his eye. He'd never imagined a place like this, let alone being part of it. They reached a council chamber where Alera's father, Lord Novith, waited. He stood tall despite his ordeal, his robes regal, his eyes sharp like hers. "Alera," he said, embracing her, "you've done more than I could have hoped." She pulled back, gesturing to Grant. "Not alone. This is Grant and his daughter, AA. They saved us both." Lord Novith studied Grant, his gaze piercing but not unkind. A human mechanic, turning the tide of a dynasty's fate. "You have my gratitude and my respect." Grant shifted, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what needed doing, sir." The older man chuckled. "Humility is rare in these halls. You'll fit in better than you think." The council meeting that followed was a blur of politics, traitors exposed, their mercenary allies routed, the Novith dynasty's power restored. Alera stood at her father's side, her voice commanding as she outlined reforms to prevent another betrayal. Grant watched from the sidelines, dozing in his lap, marveling at how Alera balanced strength and grace. She was born for this, yet she'd fought beside him in the dirt like any soldier. When the meeting ended, Alera found them in a quiet alcove overlooking the city. The spires glowed under twin moons, casting a silver sheen over the plaza below where Novith citizens gathered, their voices rising in celebration. "They're thanking us," she said, leaning against the railing, "for saving the dynasty." Grant set AA down, letting her nap on a cushioned bench. "Feels weird being part of something this big. I'm just a guy with a wrench." "You're more than that," Alera said, turning to him. "You gave me hope out there, Grant. You and AA. You reminded me what I'm fighting for." He met her gaze, her eyes shifting to a warm violet, almost glowing in the moonlight. "You're not so bad yourself, princess. Got a hell of a shot with that blaster." She laughed, the sound light and unguarded. "I'll take that as a compliment." A soft melody drifted up from the plaza, a Novith song with notes that seemed to hum in his chest. Alera tilted her head, a playful glint in her eyes. "Care to dance?" "It's tradition after a victory." Grant hesitated, glancing at his scuffed boots. "I'm no good at dancing. Fleet bars didn't exactly teach waltzing." "Neither am I," she admitted, stepping closer. "But I'll lead." Before he could protest, she took his hand, her touch cool and steady, pulling him into a slow sway. The music wrapped around them, its rhythm guiding their steps under the stars. Her robe brushed his arm, and he caught that familiar scent, ozone and flowers, drawing him in. They moved closer, her hand resting on his shoulder, his on her waist, the space between them shrinking. "You're not half bad," she teased, her voice low. "Beginner's luck," he replied, his heart picking up pace. Her eyes held his, the world fading until it was just them, the music, the night. He leaned in, or maybe she did, their faces inches apart, her breath warm against his lips. But a giggle broke the moment. Awake now, watching with wide eyes. "Daddy's dancing." Grant pulled back, chuckling, his cheeks warm. Alera laughed too, stepping away, though her fingers lingered in his for a moment longer. "Another time," she said softly, a promise in her tone. They returned to the bench, AA climbing into Grant's lap. Alera sat beside them, her presence calming. "What now?" he asked, the question heavy with possibility. "Stay," she said simply. "The palace has room for you both. A workshop for you, a school for AA. You've earned a home here, if you want it." He looked at AA, her sleepy smile, then at the city below, alive with light and hope. He'd spent years drifting, fixing what was broken, keeping his daughter safe. This stability, purpose, maybe even something more with Alera, was more than he'd dared hope for. "We'll stay," he said, his voice firm. "But I'm keeping my toolbox." Alera grinned. "Wouldn't have it any other way." As the moons rose higher, the three of them sat together, the future stretching out like the stars above, bright, uncertain, and full of promise.